Hello everyone, welcome in today's video. In today's video, we'll be looking at calculating Brainiac's IQ from his lowest to the highest that I can find, at least to a finite level. What this video covers is quite a lot. Starting off with the main topics, we'll be calculating first what a 12th level intellect is in DC Comics. After that, we'll go over Brainiac's first official intelligence rating he gets when he meets Superman in person for the first time. After that, I'll go over two enhanced versions of Brainiac, one being a planet-sized brain of Brainiac, and another one being that of a future version of Brainiac. And then I'll go over what I think is probably the most intelligent one that at least I could calculate, being the new 52 Convergence Brainiac. However, to do the very things I've just outlined, I'm going to actually have to do a lot more calculations in the background. For example, I'm going to have to demonstrate that the Milky Way galaxy in DC Comics has in fact a higher population than the max observable universe population I've done in my previous IQ scaling videos. Also, I'm going to have to calculate the IQ of the average Kryptonian, such as Superman, his cousin, and his father. Also, then after that, I'm going to have to calculate the speed of which Brainiac can do different processes at a maximum population for the DC universe, which of course will be magnified by the fact that I have to calculate the massive size of the DC universe population given this IQ. And then as one final bonus, because why not, if I'm going to calculate the intellect level of Brainiac and I can make a formula that goes from IQ to intellect, why don't I also calculate the intellect level of these characters, going from 4 of which I've mentioned in previous videos, as well as that 4 of which that I've not mentioned in previous videos. Let's talk about Brainiac's origin so we know just how intelligent he was to start off with. First, let's show this guide and see it's complete nonsense. The actual origin of Brainiac was that his race was one of the smartest in an entire galaxy, and despite that they were only an 8th level intellect, being the colon. However, Brainiac was literally born as a 12th level intellect. That was before he starts doing his cybernetic enhancements. Meaning, after we calculate a 12th level intellect, we're going to have to upscale it further with his cybernetic enhancements to get his true IQ. For us to be able to then calculate a conversion rate from intellects to an IQ level, we're going to need some data points to use. The first one we'll use is that we know that the average human is considered a 3rd level intellect, so we say that an intellect level of 3 is equivalent to an IQ of 100. Now interestingly, in DC 1 million we know that a 9th level intellect is the highest of that of planet Earth, and as I've mentioned in my previous IQ videos, the highest intelligence expected on planet Earth is 193. However, we shouldn't be using that because, as we know, the context of DC Universe is far different than that of real life, to the point we actually know what the highest IQ is in DC 1 million, that being of Batman 1 million with an IQ of 1045. Far bigger than the 193 we'd expect to be the max of planet Earth. For our last data point, we'll be using that of an 8th level intellect. Now this gets a bit more complicated. It's directly stated that both the Kryptonians and the colon are an 8th level intellect. However, they are vastly different in terms of IQ. For example, we know that the colon are in fact one of the highest in a galaxy, but not the highest of an entire galaxy. We also know that comparing colon and Kryptonians, Superman has directly stated that the brain of a colon like Brainiac is 1,000 times more than that of a Kryptonian. So how are we going to calculate what is an intellect level of 8? What would that IQ be? Well, luckily, we have one statement from Brainiac that at one point he had not yet reached the assimilation of all beings in a galaxy. And then, in the same comic, he also stated that he was already assimilated about 7 octodecillion beings. 7 octodecillion beings is absolutely gigantic. If you recall, the max population we expected for the Milky Way galaxy was only 64 sextillion. In fact, for the entire observable universe, the max population was 8 duodecillion. Meaning a population of 7 octodecillion, which Brainiac had already done, but wasn't quite a galaxy yet, is bigger than the observable universe. So the Milky Way galaxy in DC Comics is bigger than the observable universe, at least by this methodology. And then we know, since that's about galaxy level, we should probably use that as our 8th level intellect. Doing so, we get an IQ of approximately 341. Since you're interested, the colons are stated by Brainiac to have a brain 70 times more than this, giving them an IQ of about 345 on average, while the Kryptonians had 1/1000th of this with an IQ of 338. This does mean that in fact Superman has an IQ higher than an 8-year-old fox and a walking egg, but not quite as much as a drunken grandpa. So this is our data to work with. Now let's build a model that will convert a DC intellect to an equivalent real-life IQ. Now when doing this, it got very complicated, to the point where I tried over 100 different equations, and these were the 6 best ones, 3 of which were polynomial style equation and 3 of which were exponential. Allow me to explain which one works and why. Starting off with the polynomials, it initially looked very convincing, with all the data points matching the known and predicted. However, as you may have noticed from this chart, 2 of our data points look a bit suspicious, and that is when we predict an intellect level of 0, the predicted IQ is in fact higher than the known IQ for an intellect level of 3, which doesn't make any sense. And if we plot what's going on, we find that polynomial models always have a dip between their data points when trying to match them all up. Meaning, this model will never work because it predicts anything with an intellect level of 3 higher than an intellect level of 6, which doesn't make any sense. So for that, none of these polynomial models would work. Now for the exponential style equations, we have a different problem. In the table, 2 of the models don't match up the data at all, being wildly over or massively under what the actual known values were for predicted IQ against known IQ. But the full exponential equation we see at the top there actually matches up line for line. So let's make sure it's continuous and doesn't dip like the polynomials. Looking at the graph, we can see this directly. The blue line goes through all the points and is constantly going up to represent the fact that it is continuous. So we can use this to predict our IQs for different intellect levels. And in fact, I have an entire table of it right here. So to give a comparison of just how fast this equation is increasing, we can look at this. This would be the line of a linear equation. Next, a standard exponential equation looks like this. Next, the IQ equation that shows that populations go absolutely gigantic in proportionality to an IQ is approximately in the order of this. Meanwhile, the calculation of an intellect level relative to IQ is about this, only being slightly faster. So as you can clearly see, an intellect level of 12 is equivalent to an IQ of 452,995.05. Meaning that if someone would be considered the smartest in the universe in the DC universe, they must have an IQ of over 452,000. Now, as we've done in my previous IQ videos, we can actually convert that into populations and then find out just how much times bigger the DC universe is compared to the observable universe. And man, is it massive. In my previous videos, I calculated that if every single planet in the observable universe had a population like Earth, we would get 8 duodecillion beings, or 8 times 10 to the 39. Meanwhile, the population the DC universe must have to naturally spawn a 12th level intellect is absolutely massive at 5.1845 times 10 to the 197 million. If you remember in the death battle of Goku vs Superman 3, they had about 1.62 times 10 to the 63 times our observable universe, or a novendecillion times bigger than what they got for Universe 7 in that video. However, if we use this calculation with an IQ of 452,000, we instead get our DC universe being 10 to the 10 to the 8.2966 times the observable universe. That is not even close and way bigger. In fact, I think this is the largest calculation you'll ever see for the DC universe at a finite level. Of course, being a 12th level intellect isn't actually unique to just Brainiac. An example of another character who should scale to it would be someone like Lex Luthor, who's so intelligent he can grant a 12th level intellect to other characters, and even in the same comic after granting that level of intelligence, he can then outsmart the character anyway. This same Lex Luthor, despite being insanely intelligent, wants to call himself the smartest person on Earth, but then first has to look around to make sure Batman isn't around, implying that Batman is on an equivalent level of a 12th level intellect as well. However, as I said very early on in the video, Brainiac had an IQ that was a 12th level intellect when he was born, before he did any of his cybernetic enhancements. So when he starts having his cybernetic enhancements, just how much smarter is he? And for that, I had broke it down into 4 different variants, as I mentioned at the very start of this video. Let's go into each one of them. Now this first variant of Brainiac I'm going to talk about, I'm going to call Base Brainiac, because this is the first true Brainiac form we see that meets Superman. In his description, he said that he started off and it took him an entire year to do a single planet. So 1 terrestrial year, 365.25 days, to do 8 billion beings. However, he's at the point now that he could do 7 octodecillion beings, being that of nearly an entire galaxy, in only a matter of hours. To say how many hours he's talking about, I'll use the text colloquially in the fact he says 6 months and 6 weeks prior to this, to imply that when he means several hours, he means about 6 hours. This gives an absolutely massive multiplier for how much smarter he got, being 1.38 quindecillion, or 1.38 times 10 to the 53 times smarter. If we use our IQ equation we defined in previous videos, put in the population of the DC universe, and then times it by that massive multiplier, we find that the IQ is now 452,995.11, meaning his IQ went up by 0.06. Barely anything, and that's because his IQ is so massive, big multipliers struggle to increase it. But why stop there? We can in fact go much bigger. As shown to me by my friend Niantic the Hero, there's a time in pre-crisis when Brainiac had made a planet-sized computer, or nigh planet-sized computer, that was smarter than him because it was basically a giant version of his own brain. And in fact, in later comics, he's made bigger ones because he has converted Warworld into one of those computers. We actually have a calculation on Reddit for the size of Warworld, and using a calculation that is used for a planet-sized supercomputer, which actually is a real thing, it's called a Jupiter brain in a colloquial term between theoretical physicists, we can estimate how many times smarter this brain would be compared to the base Brainiac we said a second ago. And the multiplier we get from base Brainiac is about 1.16 sextillion times more. So then compared to that of a 12th level intellect, our baseline beforehand, this multiplier is about 1.48 times 10 to the 72 times more. That is a trevigintillion times more. And if we apply that in our IQ equation as a much bigger multiplier, we get a planet Brainiac IQ of 452,995.13. So they went up by 0.2 IQ points from that of base Brainiac. Still not very big, but we can do much better. Now again, from my pal Niantic, he was able to find a future version of Brainiac, where all of his cells should be more advanced than anything in the past, including the planet Brainiac. And then not just that, all of his cells work in unison to power the giant Brainiac. And the number of cells that are working are at the atomic size, and there is a billion trillion of them. Now you might think that this makes a multiplier of 10 to the 45 or a quattrodecillion times more, but it actually doesn't. Instead, we need to calculate it like I did in my Rick Sanchez video. We set the average IQ, instead of the 100 plus at the start, we need to put a 452,995.13, the IQ of planet Brainiac. And then our population is simply the billion trillion, or 10 to the power of 45. This then gives an IQ of future Brainiac being 453,207.25. Now this may not look like a huge increase, being only a 312.13. However, this increase is actually insane when you work out the population multiplier. How you work out the population multiplier is with this equation here, where we'll use the difference between a 12th level intellect Brainiac and that of this future Brainiac here. This gives us a multiplier of 4.31571 times 10 to the 184,000. That is absolutely gigantic. However, we can do much better. Now for the highest IQ calculation I can do for Brainiac, we have to look to DC Convergence. In that story, Brainiac already had the intelligence that was equivalent to of assimilating the main 52 universes, if not more. So this means that when we're doing our IQ calculation, we can use the absolutely massive population of the DC universe to add in as a multiplier instead of the small multipliers we were using for the past 3 versions. But that's not quite correct. As we mentioned with base Brainiac, the multiplier isn't just the number of people he's assimilated, but also how fast he assimilates it. Remember, he went from doing 8 billion people in a terrestrial year to 7 octodecillion beings in only a few hours. So we need to find out the rate. Now to explain the type of equation we are looking for. If it was directly proportional to the population, we would just use a linear equation like this. However, we need to include the fact that time increases as well, and because of the time and speed also increasing but much slower than that of the population increasing, we need to add a secondary factor. An idea of something to add could be something like this logarithmic equation here. Multiplying those two together, you get an equation like this, which is faster than the linear equation. However, in my studies, I found that's actually closer to x log x squared, which is a little bit faster at this. In the end, the correct equation I had come up with was in the format closer to this, which is much faster than a linear equation, but slower than a polynomial equation, as shown by this polynomial here, which very slowly outpaces it. However, if you think the equation itself is the only complicated part of this modelling, you are wrong. There is a lot of things still complicated. For example, I just said that our data was that of population, as you can see the different population levels here in number of beings. And then it was using time with the statements that Brainiac had said. However, we wanted rate, so instead we need to do the inverse of all these times, and times it then with that of our population, and we get these rates. However, once again, using these populations will be very hard for modelling because all the numbers are huge, so let's convert them in from numbers of beings into numbers of worlds. But then once again, even though it's in number of worlds, this still isn't correct. Because when Brainiac assimilates worlds, they are cumulative, they add up each time. So at step 2, even though he's saying an extra 4 worlds, that's technically 1 plus 4 for a total of 5 worlds. And then in the next step, instead of being 20 worlds, it's actually 25 worlds. And we can do that all the way up to the 7 octodecillion beings, but converted straight into worlds, as we know that is the total. So this is our data here we need to model on. And after trying over 200 different equations with different variables, the closest I could come up with is still slightly under predicting. So just note that this end result I'm going to be talking about is actually a slight underestimate. Now before I actually use the formula, let me describe just how fast this is. At base Brainiac, he was already able to assimilate 7 octodecillion beings in a matter of hours, which if we say that scales to meters per second, that gives him a speed of 1.08 times 10 to the 45 times the speed of light. That is about 50 times faster than the speed calculation for the Flash that Imaginary Axis had done. And that is before we use the formula for the full DC universe population. If we use the formula for the massive population of 52 times that of the DC universe, we get a speed of 2.71 times 10 to the 197 million times the speed of light. This is much faster than the speed calculation for the characters in the Amazing World of Gumball, but not quite as fast as the speed calculation for the fan character that is Superman Prime 10 billion. Now we have this absolutely massive multiplier that is the rate of which Brainiac can process information. We can apply it to our formula and then get the end result for Brainiac on Convergence, his IQ. And it has increased a significant amount now, being an IQ of 640,000. Now one interesting thing you can do now that we have the IQ of each version of Brainiac is to work out their intellect level. Obviously Brainiac when he was born has an intellect level of 12 for his IQ. Then the base Brainiac, who had a slightly bigger IQ, is still that of an intellect level of 12. And the same for Planet Brainiac, still an intellect level of 12. The future Brainiac, which was ridiculously times more intelligent, is 12.002. And then the smartest version of Brainiac, for the highest IQ I could calculate, being that of Convergence, is only an intellect level of 12.1436. If you're wondering what a 13th level intellect would look like, that would be an IQ of 5.5 million. Now, let's do the fun part. Let's convert some known IQs, or some that I've calculated in the past, and convert them to a DC intellect level. I think it'll be fun to start off with that there is a misconception. If you look up online for what is Batman's IQ, many sources will say 192. This is incorrect. It's based on a scaling quote that Batman's smarter than Ted Kort, in which Ted Kort has an IQ of 192. Ted Kort at an IQ of 192 gets an intellect level of surprisingly high 6.8. If we then look at Spider-Man with his galaxy level IQ in Marvel Comics, that is 250, that is an intellect level of 7.5. If we scale up further to an 8-year-old fox or an egg that has an IQ of 300, that is an intellect level of 7.8. If we scale up further to what is the intellect level of a Kryptonian, as stated in this video, it's almost out of an 8th level intellect at 7.99. Then the colon, being one of the smartest in a galaxy, being slightly above an 8th level intellect, is 8.01. If we upscale much further to an IQ of 373, that is the IQ I calculated for Rick Sanchez, and that has an intellect level of surprisingly low 8.1. If we scale higher to Ultimate Car's IQ of 400, we again only get an intellect level of 8.18. If we go much further to the IQ stated of that of Alakazam from Pokemon, which is 5000, we get an intellect level of 9.9. If we scale even higher to a much higher IQ of that of, surprisingly, Bowser from the Super Mario series, he has a stated IQ of 9800, which is equivalent to an intellect level of 10.26. Now the next character has two different IQ levels depending if it's anime or manga. In the manga version, Todo from Jujutsu Kaisen has an IQ of 53,000, which is an intellect level just over 11. However, in the anime his IQ is even higher, being higher than that of most versions of Brainiac at 530,000, which is an intellect level of 12.065. Now for the highest IQ that I've seen so far in fiction, being that of Brainstorm's 1 nonillion. That's a 1 followed by 30 zeros. If we convert that to the intellect level, it's a surprisingly low 26.54. The one thing I want to say a bit off topic is thank you all for the support in my previous video where I broke the record for the highest finite speed calculation done for a fictional character, being that of Maiden Heaven. That video did quite well, getting 10,000 views in less than 2 weeks, and it was so good in fact that it has appeared on the Googology wiki as an official number now. You can now find the Heaven recurrence time, link in the description. So I thought most Googologists don't just do a number, they normally do an entire sequence. So why don't I define an entire sequence? I've actually got the material to do this already. So let's do that. Let's show the rearrangement that I did in my first power scaling intelligence video, where I rearranged the normal distribution equation into our number of people equation, and let's denote that as EP. And we can use this as our sequence for our Googology. Now, while I can add all the different IQs I've done in this video, quite honestly, some of the smaller IQs wouldn't qualify as a Googology. As we can see in these ones on the left here, when I start doing the IQs between 192 Ted Court to Ultimate Cars 400, the max number we get is 27.17 octovigintillion, which is a large number, but if we're going to make a number large enough to be a Googology, or a Googlism, it needs to be at least more than what I'd say is a centillion, or 10 to the power of 606. While the smaller IQs won't qualify as a Googlism, the larger ones, starting at Batman 1 million at an IQ of 1045, all the way up to Brainstorm's 1 nonillion IQ, should all definitely qualify as a Googlism, being absolutely massive. Much larger than a centillion. Now you see, I'm not just doing this to get a bunch of large numbers on the Googology wiki. Instead, what I'm actually doing is trying to give you people, the viewers, an opportunity to make your own Googology. The idea is that as long as you can find a fictional character who's not in this video and has an IQ over 891.4, that character's IQ will be large enough that the population will surpass a centillion. Meaning it's large enough that you can name your own number. The one final thing I got for you viewers is something that I want you guys to comment down below. You see, in the same statement that where it says Batman 1 million has an IQ of 1045, there actually is a possible higher IQ stated on the same scan, and that is of Superman 1 million. The only problem is, it's so nonsensical you think it's Scrooge McDuck's money. And that's because it's stated to be a genius to the power of 10 Einstein units. Whatever that means. If you want me to make a whole video trying to work out exactly what this statement means, and could it be higher than that of Brainstorm from Ben 10, comment down below. Thank you all for watching this video. Check out the description of this video where you can find a link to my Discord server. The link will last for about a week. Ask any admin to verify you, as well as a list of other different power scaling channels that I find quite interesting that I hope you all will enjoy. Here is a link to my most recent video, YouTube's recommended video to you, as well as the power scaling intelligence IQ list. With that, thank you all for watching. Have a good day.